Introduction to Research in International Law for the Environmental Legal Research course at Boston College Law School. International law is sometimes confused with foreign law. Foreign law is the domestic law of a foreign country. International law can generally be divided into two types. The first one, private international law, focuses on individuals from more than one country, usually involved in business or commerce, but also in family law situations. This is primarily a choice of law issue. And the other type, public international law, is the law reflecting the custom and practice of sovereign states as they deal with each other, with international organizations, and with persons. The most important primary source of international law is the treaty. Treaties can also be called agreements or conventions. Treaties and agreements can be self-executing and go into force immediately, or they may be non-self-executing and need subsequent implementing legislation. Other important sources of international law include judicial decisions from both national and international courts, customary law, general principles of law recognized by civilized nations, and the writings of scholars. Most of us don't even realize that United States federal courts at all levels define, interpret, and apply treaties and principles of international law on an almost daily basis. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties defines a treaty as an international agreement concluded between and among states or international organizations in written form and governed by the principles of international law. Regardless of what it is called, a treaty, an agreement, a convention, or a covenant, if a document meets the requirements of the Vienna Convention, it is a treaty. Treaties can be bilateral, between two parties, or multilateral, between three or more countries. For multilateral treaties, signing is only the first step. It shows that the country that signed intends, in principle, to become a party, but signing does not necessarily bind a state. The next step for multilateral treaties would be ratification by each state. Here in the U.S., we have two different forms of international agreements. One we call executive agreements. These are not submitted to the U.S. Senate, and they go into effect on signing. Bilateral agreements tend to be executive agreements. The other kind, called Article II treaties, are negotiated by the executive branch, and then they are submitted to the Senate for advice and consent. They require a two-thirds vote of the Senate in order to be ratified, and then, eventually, they can go into effect. A country can also agree to be bound by a treaty without signing it through a process called accession. Ratifying a multilateral treaty may not be enough to bring it into force. Usually there's some kind of triggering event, often involving a minimum number of states having ratified or acceded to it. Even after a treaty is entered into force, additional parties can still sign onto the treaty. So, dates to make note of in treaty research can include the date the treaty was signed, ratified, and entered into force in general, or for a specific signatory. Once a country has ratified or acceded to a treaty, what has it actually agreed to be bound by? Exactly what it chooses to be bound by. Any signatory to a treaty can make a reservation, which is a statement that there is some provision of the treaty that they are excluding or modifying, probably because of their domestic law. This reservation could also be called an understanding, a declaration, or an interpretive statement. These are sometimes referred to as RUDs. So, the research process for treaties. You will need to find the text of the treaty. You have to decide if the treaty is in force. You have to look at who the parties to the treaty are and when they became parties to the treaty, and you have to see if there are any important reservations that they've made. To interpret the treaty provisions, you may want to look at secondary sources, court decisions, and legislative history.